She'll never admit it out loud. But there's one thing a narcissistic woman fears more than being exposed, more than being left, more than being seen for exactly who she is. And it has everything to do with the good man she thought she could hurt without consequence. If you've ever been the good man in this story, the one who gave everything, who stayed patient, who kept choosing her even when something inside you knew better, you need to hear this. Because what happens after you finally stop choosing her is something she is almost never prepared for, no matter how in control she seemed while she was hurting you. Let's talk about what a narcissistic woman actually fears most, and why the answer isn't what most people assume. First, let's clear up a misconception, because it matters for everything that follows. People assume narcissists fear loneliness. They don't, not really. Not in the way you or I understand loneliness. What they fear is irrelevance, being forgotten, losing their audience. A narcissistic woman can be surrounded by people and feel perfectly fine, as long as those people are still watching her, still orbiting her, still treating her as the center of the story. What she cannot tolerate, what genuinely destabilizes her, is the specific quiet horror of realizing that someone she hurt has stopped watching altogether. That's where this story starts. Picture a man, let's call him Marcus, steady, patient. The kind of man who shows up early, remembers small details, apologizes first even when he's not entirely sure he was wrong, because keeping the peace matters more to him than being right. He met a woman, we'll call her Vanessa, who was magnetic in that specific way that good men find almost impossible to resist. Confident, a little unpredictable, someone who made ordinary moments feel like they mattered more because she was in them. In the beginning, Vanessa made Marcus feel like the most important man alive. She hung on his stories. She told him within weeks that she'd never met anyone like him. And Marcus, steady, careful, good-hearted Marcus, let himself believe it, because why wouldn't he? He was giving her exactly that kind of devotion in return. But here's the thing about good men and narcissistic women, and I want you to really absorb this, because it's the engine that drives everything that follows. A narcissistic woman doesn't fall for a good man the way she falls for anyone else. She recognizes him, almost immediately, as a resource, stability, devotion, emotional labor she'll never have to reciprocate in full. Good men, by nature, tend to give generously and assume good faith in return. And that generosity, to a narcissist, isn't something to cherish. It's something to extract from. So, the extraction began, slowly, the way it always does. Small requests that turned into standing expectations. Emotional labor that flowed almost entirely in one direction. When Marcus had a bad week, Vanessa grew distant, almost irritated, as though his need for support was an imposition on her time. When Vanessa had a bad week, Marcus canceled plans, rearranged his schedule, showed up with exactly the right words, because that's who he was, and she knew it and she used it again and again, without ever quite acknowledging that she was using it at all. Here's where it gets specifically cruel in the particular way narcissistic women often operate. She didn't just take. She punished him for being the kind of man who gave. His steadiness, the very thing that made him safe, started to be reframed, subtly, as boring. His patience became passive. His refusal to fight became avoidant. She began comparing him, sometimes openly, to other men, men who were more exciting, more spontaneous, men who kept her on her toes, and Marcus, who had never once given her a reason to doubt him, started quietly, silently absorbing the message that being good, being reliable, being devoted wasn't actually enough. This is one of the most disorienting things good men experience with narcissistic partners, being punished not for what they did wrong, but for what they did right. Loyalty gets reframed as clinginess. Consistency gets reframed as predictability, which somehow becomes an insult. Emotional generosity gets treated as an obligation instead of a gift, until eventually it stops even being noticed as a gift at all. Marcus stayed for a year and a half. Not because he didn't see what was happening. Some part of him did, quietly, in the moments alone in his car after another conversation that left him feeling smaller than he'd walked in. He stayed because good men are frequently taught, culturally and personally, that leaving equals failure. That real commitment means enduring. That if the relationship isn't working, the answer is to give more, try harder, be better, never to question whether the other person is actually capable of meeting him halfway. And then it happened the way it usually does, not with a dramatic blow-up, but with something almost anticlimactic. Marcus found out, through a friend, almost by accident, that Vanessa had been emotionally entangled with a co-worker for months. Nothing she'd technically call cheating, she'd insist later, just someone I could talk to. Except the texts told a different story. A story of exactly the kind of intimacy she'd stopped offering Marcus a long time ago. He didn't scream. He didn't beg her to explain. Something in him, finally, quietly, broke in a useful direction instead of a destructive one. He looked at her, said almost nothing, and started, that same week, to leave. And this is where we get to what she actually fears. Vanessa's first move, predictably, was the apology tour. Tearful, elaborate, full of promises to change, framed almost entirely around how much she'd suffer without him. This is standard narcissistic crisis response, not genuine remorse for the damage done, but panic at the loss of supply, dressed up in the language of heartbreak. Marcus, to his enormous credit, didn't take the bait. He'd spent 18 months learning, the hard way, what her tears actually meant, and this time he recognized the performance for exactly what it was. When the apology tour failed, Vanessa moved to phase 2, which is where the real fear starts to surface. She began quietly, reaching out to mutual friends, reframing the story before Marcus could tell it himself. She was worried about him. He'd been distant and hard to reach lately. She hinted, without ever quite saying it outright, that maybe he'd been the difficult one all along. This is textbook narcissistic damage control, not because she particularly cared what the friend group believed, but because her sense of self depends on being seen as the reasonable one, the sympathetic one, the one who tried her best with someone who apparently couldn't be pleased. Here's the fear, named plainly. A narcissistic woman's greatest terror after hurting a good man is that he will simply, calmly, tell the truth. And that the truth, once spoken without hysteria, without exaggeration, just plainly and factually, will be more compelling than anything she can construct to compete with it. Because good men, when they finally do talk about what happened, don't need to embellish. They don't need to perform victimhood. They just describe what actually occurred in specific, quiet detail, and that specificity is devastating precisely because it's so obviously not fabricated. Vanessa knew, somewhere beneath the performance, that if Marcus ever fully told his side, calmly, without the anger she could dismiss as him being dramatic, without the desperation she could dismiss as him not being over her, people would believe him. And once people believed him, the version of herself she needed everyone to see, the reasonable, sympathetic, misunderstood woman, would collapse. That's the fear, not losing Marcus. She'd already, functionally, lost him weeks before she was willing to admit it to herself. What she feared was losing the narrative, losing control of the story, being seen, clearly, by people whose opinion she'd spent years curating, as the person who actually caused the damage. And there's a second fear sitting right underneath that first one, quieter but just as powerful, the fear that Marcus will actually be fine without her. Genuinely fine. Not performatively fine, not fine as a defense mechanism she can see through and exploit, but actually structurally fine, rebuilding a life that doesn't orbit her anymore. Because if he's fine, if he moves on, if he eventually finds someone who treats his steadiness as a gift instead of a flaw to exploit, then everything she told herself about her own irreplaceability, her own indispensability, quietly falls apart. A narcissistic woman needs the people she's hurt to remain, on some level, unable to fully move on, because their ongoing pain is proof of her impact, her power, her centrality to the story of their life. His healing is the single biggest threat to the version of herself she needs to keep believing in. In part 2, we're going to go into exactly what happened next, how Vanessa's attempts to control the narrative actually played out once mutual friends started comparing notes, what Marcus's quiet, factual honesty actually did to her reputation without him ever once trying to win, and the specific psychological reason why narcissistic women almost always underestimate exactly how much good men have been silently noticing the whole time. Stick around, because the part where the story catches up to her is coming next. Mutual friends started noticing something Vanessa never accounted for. Marcus wasn't saying anything at all. That silence was the first crack in her control of the story. She'd braced for a war of words, angry texts, a public unraveling, something dramatic she could point to and say, "See, this is what he's really like." Instead, Marcus simply stopped engaging. He didn't post about it. He didn't send the group chat a paragraph explaining his side. He just quietly, steadily, kept living his life, showing up to the same shared friend gatherings with a calm that unsettled her far more than anger would have. Here's why that silence was so dangerous for her, specifically. Narcissistic damage control depends on urgency. It depends on getting to people first, framing the narrative before the other side has a chance to speak, planting seeds of doubt. He's been distant, he's not handling this well, I'm honestly a little worried about him. So that whatever Marcus eventually says, if he says anything, arrives into an audience already primed to see him as unstable or bitter. That strategy only works, though, if the target reacts on her timeline. Marcus never gave her one. He answered direct questions from close friends honestly and briefly when they asked, no elaboration, no persuasion campaign, and otherwise let the silence speak for itself. And silence, it turns out, is almost impossible to argue with. About 6 weeks in, one of their closest mutual friends, a woman named Priya, who'd known them both for years, started noticing inconsistencies. Small ones at first. Vanessa had told her Marcus just stopped communicating one day, out of nowhere. But Priya remembered a conversation from months earlier where Vanessa herself had mentioned, almost offhand, being close with a co-worker in a way that had made Priya quietly uncomfortable at the time. She hadn't thought much of it then. Now it sat differently. Priya did what a lot of people do when a story stops adding up. She asked Marcus directly, not to interrogate him, just a simple, "Hey, can I ask what actually happened?" And Marcus, true to form, didn't seize the opportunity to tear Vanessa apart. He told her plainly, factually, without embellishment, what he'd found out, when he'd found out it, how long it had apparently been going on, and how he'd decided to leave. No adjectives designed to make Vanessa look monstrous. No exaggeration, just the sequence of events, delivered with the specific, unhurried calm of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing left to prove. This is the moment narcissists fear most, and it's worth naming precisely why. A plainly stated truth, delivered without emotional performance, is nearly impossible to compete with. If Marcus had been furious, tearful, dramatic, Vanessa would have had material. She could have said, "See how unstable he is. See how he's blowing this out of proportion." And some people would have believed her, because dramatic reactions are easy to discredit even when they're justified. But calm, specific, unembellished honesty doesn't give a narcissist anything to work with. There's no performance to point at. There's just a timeline that happens to match the receipts, if anyone ever bothered to check. And people did start checking, in their own quiet ways. Priya mentioned the conversation to another mutual friend. That friend remembered Vanessa canceling plans with the group around the same time she'd apparently been getting close with her coworker. Nobody staged an intervention. Nobody confronted Vanessa in some dramatic group reckoning. It was slower and in a way far more damning than that. It was the quiet, cumulative effect of several people independently arriving at the same conclusion without Marcus ever asking any of them to. By month 3, the shift in the friend group was unmistakable, even though nothing had technically been settled or declared out loud. Invitations that used to go to both of them started quietly going to Marcus alone. People who used to take Vanessa's framing at face value started asking a few more follow-up questions when she talked about the breakup. Nothing overt. No one cut her off dramatically. It was worse than that. From her perspective, it was erosion. A slow, undramatic loss of the unquestioning belief she'd always been able to count on. This is the part I really want you to understand, because it's the psychological core of the entire episode. Narcissists are built for confrontation. They're skilled at chaos, at drama, at out-arguing someone in the moment, at turning a direct accusation into a referendum on the accuser's character instead. What they are almost never prepared for is quiet, patient, factual erosion, the slow process of people simply noticing things over time and drawing their own conclusions. There's no dramatic moment to win. There's no single conversation to dominate. It just happens, gradually, entirely outside her control, and by the time she realizes it's happening, there's no single scene she can walk into and fix it. Meanwhile, Marcus was doing something Vanessa hadn't planned for at all. He was actually healing. Not performing healing for an audience. Actually doing it. He started therapy, not to process getting her back, but to understand why he'd stayed as long as he had, why the erosion of his own needs had felt normal to him for so long. He reconnected with friendships that had quietly atrophied during the relationship, the way they so often do when one partner slowly absorbs all of someone's time and attention. 8 months out, he started seeing someone new. Nothing serious right away, just someone who, he noticed almost immediately, responded to his steadiness like it was a gift instead of something to be exploited. And that, more than the friend group, more than the reputation, more than any of it, was the thing Vanessa genuinely could not tolerate. Because somewhere in her worldview, Marcus was supposed to be proof of her power, proof that she could take a good man, use him, discard him, and leave him circling the drain of what she'd done to him indefinitely. His actual, visible, unforced healing broke that entire equation. It meant the story wasn't about her anymore. It never really had been, but now even she couldn't pretend otherwise. There's a wider pattern here worth naming clearly, because Marcus's story isn't unique. It's actually remarkably typical of how these dynamics resolve when the good man in question finally fully disengages. Narcissistic women who target steady, devoted partners are making a calculated bet, even if it's not a fully conscious one, that his goodness includes an obligation to keep protecting her, even after she's hurt him, that he'll stay quiet out of decency, that he won't want to stoop to her level. And often, that bet pays off for a while because good men often do hesitate to speak plainly about what was done to them, out of exactly that kind of decency. But decency and silence aren't the same thing, and that's the distinction that undoes the whole strategy. A good man doesn't need to attack her, exaggerate, or campaign against her to be believed. He just needs to eventually, calmly, tell the truth to the people who ask him and stop performing a version of being fine for her benefit while quietly falling apart in private. Once he does both of those things, the narrative she spent so much energy trying to control starts writing itself, without her getting a single vote in how it turns out. If you've been the Marcus in your own story, the one who gave everything, who got punished for being steady, who's now sitting in the quiet aftermath wondering if staying silent means you're somehow losing, I want you to hear this clearly. You're not losing. The people who matter are watching more closely than you think, and the truth, told plainly and without performance, is more powerful than anything she can construct to compete with it. You don't have to fight for that outcome. You just have to keep being honest, and keep healing, and let time do the rest. If this episode named something you've lived through, I'd really love to hear about it in the comments. These stories help more people than you'd expect see their own situation more clearly. And if you want more of this kind of psychology every week, how narcissists operate and exactly what it looks like when the people they've hurt finally, quietly, win one, subscribe to Mind Horizon. I'll see you in the next one.